John Gambrell is a reporter with the Associated Press in Dubai, and he covers Saudi Arabia. He's been following the Jamal Khashoggi story. Mr. Gambrell, first of all, thanks for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
What is the latest? What are we hearing? What's the latest you're hearing there about the disappearance of Mr. Khashoggi?
Well, as of right now, the Washington Post is reporting, citing anonymous sources, that Turkish officials have both video and audio of Mr. Khashoggi's alleged killing and dismemberment in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. Now, Saudi officials haven't commented on this or haven't really said much in the last few days, but previously described the allegations against it as, quote, baseless. That being said, they've been unable to offer any evidence that shows Mr. Khashoggi ever left the consulate unharmed on October 2nd. And it's particularly questionable because Mr. Khashoggi's fiancée was standing outside waiting for him for hours afterwards, and he never arrived.
I was going to say that because that's one of the things in this story that's absolutely incredible. She waited for 10 to 12 hours for him to exit the embassy, never saw him come out. She's the ultimate eyewitness. Does anyone believe the Saudi version?
Well, I don't know if it's a matter of believe as much as the Saudis really haven't offered any of the video evidence or any stills or photography to show what happened to Mr. Khashoggi from the moments after he entered the consulate. The Turks have aired some surveillance footage that looks suspicious, that involves diplomatic plated cars moving around afterwards to the consul's house, that shows an alleged 15-man Saudi hit squad, is what the Turkish media described it, coming into the country the same day and leaving the country the same day. So really, I think the onus at this point seems to be on the Saudis to provide evidence to support their claim.
Jamal Khashoggi had moved to the United States. He said he was in fear of his own threats from Saudi authorities. He said he feared for his own safety. He was writing for the Washington Post. And he was very critical of the Saudi regime. And in fact, he was rallying a lot of other critics of the regime. How much of a problem, how much of a thorn in the side was he to the Saudi regime?
The interesting thing about Jamal Khashoggi is that he was a link between the West and the sort of Byzantine movements of the Saudi royal court. He was an insider in a certain sense. I mean, he was a journalist, he was a columnist, he ran a newspaper there, and as well, he served as a spokesman for a time for a Saudi official and had links to the country's intelligence services.
So this is a particularly vexing person to be criticizing the regime. What can you tell us about the regime and its treatment of dissent and of people who are going against it these days?
Well, it's very interesting. Since Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman ascended to being the second in line for the throne in the country, there have been a series of reforms that have taken place. He's had women driving. There's been a move towards getting more foreign direct investment from outside firms. But at the same time, we've also seen him crack down on the same women's rights activists who wanted women to drive. We've seen him do a roundup of Saudi royals, businessmen, activists, and others, which he described as an anti-corruption push, but then turned out to look more like a shakedown, as a lot of those businessmen had to sign over their assets to Saudi Arabia.
I guess that's the other question, and that is when we criticize the Saudi regime, we were told by their foreign minister in New York City that any criticism of the new crown prince actually ties his hands, and that he's the man, as you mentioned, he's the man who's going to bring in reforms. And if we criticize them, his enemies, it just emboldens his enemies, and the reforms won't come in. Should we put any currency to that?
It's a difficult question to know. I mean, Saudi Arabia has always been very sensitive to outside criticism. And one of its most important relationships is with the United States and the West. And these criticisms do strike at the heart of the Saudi government. That being said, Saudi Arabia is a very insular country. The House of Saud, this family has ruled the country for decades. And ultimately, it's a kingdom, absolute power, and they can make decisions based on what the ruling family wants.
I guess the other question is, you mentioned, I mean, this is a man, Mr. Khashoggi, was in the United States. He was writing for the Washington Post. A lot of people are looking to the United States and to President Trump to respond to what appears to be a really blatant human rights violation, a brazen one. President Trump says he's not going to cancel any of the multi-billion-dollar contracts with Saudi Arabia. That's not the way to go about it. What do you make of the American response?
It's interesting. It's a little bit of a mixed bag. The State Department has come out and said they're concerned about Mr. Khashoggi. There have been other U.S. lawmakers who have suggested that there could even be sanctions put in place against Saudi officials or anyone else who may be found out to be involved in this alleged disappearance and possible killing. But the Trump administration has had very, very close ties to Saudi Arabia in the time since Trump came to office. Before the Crown Prince even became the Crown Prince, he traveled to Washington. He's maintained close ties to Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. And Trump's first foreign trip overseas was to Riyadh. So there is sort of a strong bond between Trump and Saudi that wasn't there during the Barack Obama administration. The Saudis had felt a little bit put off to the side over Obama's outreach and ultimate nuclear deal with Tehran.
I guess the last question, I mean, we as Canadians, you know that we have run afoul of the Saudi regime. We're sort of in the doghouse right now. We've had a freeze in diplomatic relations because of criticisms of those arrests you mentioned and imprisonment of women activists, human rights activists there. I know you're a journalist and you're not here to cast judgment, but any reflections on, say, Canada's relationship or countries that want to take the Saudi regime to task?
Well, I think it's an interesting question right now. There's always, if you look at like the U.S. State Department, they issue reports every year that will criticize Saudi Arabia for human rights violations, so on and so forth. And there's really not that sort of muscular response to it. Under Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, we're seeing the kingdom turn from sort of a tacit acceptance to Western criticism to one of a sort of a muscular response, a muscular feel that they want to put themselves out there and they want to show that Saudi Arabia is a power. And I think that internally that helps Prince Mohammed show strength to an internal audience, especially as Saudi Arabia faces an uncertain future. It has a youthful population with a lot of people looking for jobs. And in the future, oil may not be as valuable of a resource for Saudi Arabia in the future as we move towards electric cars, so on and so forth. And even Saudi Arabia is investing in electric car makers like Tesla and others. So it's an interesting time of transition for the kingdom. We're seeing Mohammed bin Salman represents the first grandson of the kingdom's founder to be in line for the throne. Previously, it's only been the patriarch's sons. So it's a time of transition, and what happens over the next months and years could really determine how Saudi Arabia interacts with the Western world and the rest of the world.
Okay, well, John Gambrell, I want to thank you very much for taking the time. Thanks for speaking with us and sharing your insights.
Thank you.